Hi, this is Pastor Jay Stillinger, and this is Lesson 5 in our series entitled Foundations for Defending the Faith. And in this lesson, we're going to talk about our third argument for the existence of God. The last two lessons, we talked about two of those arguments for the existence of God, and there's certainly more arguments for God's existence, as I mentioned to you before, but these are understood by many people to be the most compelling, the most convincing arguments for the existence of God. Just by way of review, we talked about so far the cosmological argument, or the argument that the universe had a beginning. We looked at 5 lines of scientific evidence that the universe had a beginning, and of course the implication is that if it had a beginning, it must have had a beginner, someone who initiated it all. Secondly, we talked about last lesson the teleological argument, or the argument for design. When we see design, whether it be in the universe or whether it be in the most single cell of life, then we must logically conclude that there must have been a designer. Again, an argument for God's existence. And then today, we're going to talk about this third argument, which is the moral argument. The moral argument is a very powerful argument for God's existence. It has to do with the idea that there are absolute rights and wrongs that are intuitive in every human being. And so the argument, when it's put into its logical form, the argument goes like this. It says, first of all, every law has a lawgiver. That, I think, is rational. Everyone would probably agree to that. There is an objective moral law, which is what we're going to point out today and make very clear today that it cannot be denied. And so if there is an objective moral law, then therefore there is also an objective moral lawgiver. And that moral lawgiver must be, or is, as we would understand, be God, because He transcends the rest of us. He transcends human beings. And so He is that objective moral lawgiver that has placed a moral law on the inside of every human being. In fact, in Romans chapter 2, verses 14 and 15, the Apostle Paul, by inspiration of the Spirit of God, said this, "For when Gentiles," and that would be referring to unbelievers, "who do not have the law, by nature do the things in the law, these, although not having the law, are a law to themselves, who show the work of the law written in their hearts, their conscience also bearing witness, and between themselves their thoughts accusing or else excusing them." So notice that even an unbeliever has a law written in their hearts. It is something that God has put within us. And every human being knows it if they will recognize it. Many try to deny it, but it is undeniable, which we will see in just a few moments. There is and does exist an objective moral law. If someone were to try to deny that there are objective moral laws, there are some points that we want to present to you, equip you with, so that you can get a better idea how to refute them and how to convince them that their thinking that there are no objective moral laws is incorrect. First of all, absolutes are undeniable. Consider, we know right from wrong best by our reactions to wrongs committed against us. When there are criminal acts committed against us, all people will say that was wrong. If somebody steals your car, as the example is given here, if someone steals your wallet, if someone were to kill someone that you love in a murderous type of way, whatever the case may be, when we are wronged, we know it and we protest it. And so every human being has this basic thing on the inside of them that knows that there are objective moral laws, objective rights and wrongs that are always right and always wrong. And so, if someone were to say to you, "I don't believe in any rights or wrongs, it's all a matter of opinion," well, try to do something to show them that they don't really believe that. I mean, I don't think you should assault anyone, but you know what? If you did step on their toe on purpose, you would definitely hear a protest. They would say that was wrong. Kick them in the shin, and they'll say it's wrong. And I don't advise that you do that, but my point is, again, they're only believing that and saying that, but by their reactions, it's not really true that they believe that. And so again, they are undeniable. These absolute moral laws are undeniable. Also, we wouldn't know injustice if there was no absolute sense of justice. You only know something is wrong by comparing it to an unchanging standard of what what is right. It is the unchanging standard or basis of justice. And related to this, if there are no definite rights or wrongs, why are the prisons filled with people that have broken the law? Why is that? Why do we have criminals or even label anybody a criminal? Well, there must be some kind of moral laws that we are abiding by in order to determine that some people have broken laws and therefore deserve to be in prison. All right, so again, this idea, we would not know injustice if there was no justice, no standard by which we would measure things by. And in this photograph, you see a picture of children during the Holocaust who were tortured, who were starved, and we must ask ourselves the question, is there any action or event that is universally unjust? Universally unjust. Any action or event. I think that most people would agree that starving children and torturing children and killing children, murdering them, is always wrong, universally wrong. And you know what? If there's just one universally wrong thing, morally wrong act, then there must be a moral lawgiver. It must be concluded by that way. And I think that most would agree that this example certainly is a wrong and an injustice. Evil requires good. Evil requires good. Good requires God. Notice what former atheist C.S. Lewis had to say. As an atheist, my argument against God was that the universe seems so cruel and unjust. But how had I got this idea of just and unjust? A man does not call a line crooked unless he has some idea of a straight line. What was I comparing this universe with when I called it unjust? And again, this goes back to this idea of a moral standard. A straight line is the standard. A crooked line is that which you measure that straight line by. And so again, C.S. Lewis, a deep-thinking individual, when he was alive, he concluded, you know what? How can I say anything's unjust unless I see a standard of justness? And if I see a standard of justice, how do I know that? Where did that standard come from? And this helped him to realize that there must be a moral lawgiver as we are proposing in this. Another way of looking at this, notice the moral argument again, and we see in this line, is this line crooked or straight? Well, it's crooked, but how do we know that? Because we have the standard of what a straight line is. Remembering what we just quoted from C.S. Lewis, he said, a man does not call a line crooked unless he has some idea of a straight line. And this goes back to many of the arguments of atheists, which we'll probably mention again as we go on into this teaching. But many times, one of the arguments against the existence of God that atheists give is that there's just so much evil in the world. Well, how do you know it's evil? If you don't have some kind of standard by which you measure whether something's evil or not, how do you know that it's evil? If we're some result of a biological evolutionary process and we just came from some kind of goo or whatever, a cell or some kind of thing, chemicals coming together, and we evolved into what we are today as human beings, how can we trust that which we determine to be evil or good anyway? Again, this is a powerful argument for the existence of God, that there is a standard that is intuitively on the inside of each and every human being. Thirdly, real moral disagreements would not be possible without the moral law. Every moral issue would be a matter of opinion if you deny objective morality. And so can we really live in a society where every moral law is a matter of opinion? I don't think so. It would be chaotic. It would be something that we would really not be able to live in. I have used this example in the past in teaching various things, and that is this, that thank God for justice. If we didn't have justice in our world today, even in man's level of justice, you and I wouldn't be able to walk the streets at night. Probably not even walk the streets during the day, because if there was no sense of justice, no sense of right or wrong, we wouldn't be able to trust anybody to give us justice if we had a crime committed against us or anything else. Justice is there out of mercy, really. Justice is a result of mercy when it's done correctly. And so again, we must ask ourselves the question, is every moral issue just an opinion? I don't think so. When you think of some individuals of history, Adolf Hitler, was what he did in the Holocaust in killing millions of Jews, was that just, his opinion that it was right to do that, or was it universally wrong? Most people would agree that it was universally wrong. How about these individuals, the Ku Klux Klan? Is it their opinion? Is it their opinion that white supremacy is right and that blacks are inferior? Is that just their opinion? If it is, then then how can we in any way judge their opinion or judge their ideas as being wrong if there is no objective moral law? Of course they're wrong, and we know it intuitively that there's no supremacy in race or anything other, like that, and so we know that intuitively. But if we don't believe in objective moral laws, then we can't condemn them. We can't condemn them for believing what they believe. It's their opinion, and we have our opinion. But of course, that is not livable. That is not right. We know it on the inside. As we bring out these examples, I trust that you're seeing this. And then we have a contrast, and that is Dr. Martin Luther King. It was his voice being heard concerning equality between blacks and whites. Was he just giving his opinion, or was that an objective moral law that everybody should know on the inside? I would submit to you that that is an objective moral law. It wasn't just his opinion. We know that in God's view, that there is no distinction between races. There's neither Jew nor Greek, male nor female, etc. And so we know that biblically, but we also, human beings know it by way of a law written in our hearts, as we read from Romans chapter 2. And then, of course, Mother Teresa. I gave two bad examples and then two good ones. Mother Teresa, her self-sacrifice, her willingness to lay down her life in order to help others. I mean, was that based on an intuitive moral law that says to do good, to bless, to help? I believe it was. And again, that it wasn't just her opinion. It was something that is universal. And all of these things, moral laws, objective moral laws, are necessary in order for the world to be a better place, in order for the world to have a standard by which to live for and to strive for. Again, we give this example of Hitler and Nazism and all these things, these dead bodies of people that are Holocaust victims. Is that a matter of opinion whether that's wrong? I think not. I believe that that is a universal knowledge that every human being has, that what we're seeing in that photograph is wrong all the time, everywhere, under every circumstance. And so again, if there's only one objective moral law of right or wrong, then there must be an objective moral lawgiver, and this certainly gives you one objective moral wrong, and therefore there is a lawgiver, etc. Amen. And we could come up with many other examples of this as well. All right, evidence for an objective moral law. One, moral principles are undeniable. We already mentioned that and tried to explain that. Secondly, we can't know injustice unless we know justice. Thirdly, real moral disagreements imply an objective standard. We can't disagree unless there is an objective standard to go by. How do you discover who's right and who's wrong? If we had this comparison of Mother Teresa and Adolf Hitler, how do we determine who's right and who's wrong? Well, there's only one way that we can really determine that, and that is without an unchanging moral standard. Everything reverts to opinion and becomes emotive, or just like, I don't like that. And so if you don't like that, that makes it wrong for you, but it might be right for someone else. No, that's not the way it works, does it? No, there is, again, an unchanging moral nature and a standard of measurement that we measure, and we see the difference between right and wrong intuitively in our hearts. All right? So if there is no objective morality, and again, we see that this just doesn't work. If there is none, then these are the things that we would conclude. Who can say the Nazis were wrong? No one could if there was no objective morality. And remember, if there is one objective moral wrong, then there's an objective moral lawgiver, and that would be God. Secondly, who can say love is better than rape? Third, who can say freedom is better than slavery? Fourthly, tolerance is no better than intolerance. Terrorism is not wrong. If there is no objective moral standard, we cannot complain or accuse those that flew those airplanes into the Twin Towers back on 9/11/2001. We cannot complain and say what they did was wrong if there's no objective morality, if there's no objective moral law. And again, if that was wrong, if that was an objective moral wrong, there must be an objective moral lawgiver. And again, we're making our case and building our case in this. Also, we can't complain about the problem of evil as most atheists do. And that's one of their greatest arguments for not believing in the existence of God. And so, And we're going to explain that a little bit more as we go on into this. Now, we are not saying by this, we are not saying that atheists can't be moral. Yes, they can. Atheists can be moral. Sometimes atheists are more moral by their upbringing than Christians are. All right, so they definitely can be moral. We are not saying that atheists don't know morality, because they do. But what we are saying is this: atheists cannot justify morality. They can theorize about how we know murder is wrong, but atheism provides no immaterial objective standard that establishes why murder is wrong. And so they can say something is wrong, but they don't have anything to stand on. They can't show us why. If there is no God, then there is no standard. And so therefore, it's just a matter of their opinion again. And so again, even if they argue that, there's evil in the world, well, then how do you know it's evil? How would we not conclude that what you think is evil is just your opinion if there is no standard to go by? They have within them a standard, and they know that there's a standard that makes them say that particular thing is an evil, and that standard is something given by God and not by a biological evolutionary process, or else we couldn't trust that standard. All right, now, an immaterial objective standard of justice requires a theistic God. I don't think there's any question about that. That's the only logical conclusion that we could come up with. Darwin's doubt, in fact, was this. Charles Darwin, he said, "With me, the horrid doubt always arises whether the convictions of man's mind, which has been developed from the mind of the lower animals, are of any value or at all trustworthy. Would anyone trust in the convictions of a monkey's mind if there are any convictions in such a mind?" So he's basically saying what I just said, that if we just evolved, in this case he mentions lower animal life, then how can we trust our convictions to be right anyway? And so again, this points to a theistic God. This points to the existence of God when we understand that there is a moral objective law, an objective moral law from a moral objective lawgiver. All right, so objections to the moral argument, as we've mentioned some of these already. Let's just look at these. The presence of evil disproves the existence of God, or disproves a moral God. We'll look at this in a few moments. Also, morality is cultural. I dealt with that a little bit in lesson 2, but we're going to deal with it again real quickly here as well. And morality is relative. And so let's look at these objections just for a minute. The first one is the presence of evil disproves a moral God. Does it really? I would submit to you that it does not. It recognizes good and evil, and so therefore really the idea of evil, the idea that there is evil and that people understand that certain things are evil, really points to the existence of God, not against the existence of God. Because again, God becomes our standard to determine whether something is evil or not. And so, to call something bad, you must know what good is. And the only way you know what good is to know God, is to know what God has said is good, even if it's intuitively without you recognizing God. But to call something good implies a moral framework, or a moral set or a set of moral laws to distinguish between good and evil. The moral framework must be absolute, or your standard of good and evil can change, and you will never know good and evil. If it changes, if it vacillates, we never know whether something is good or evil. If we, for example, consider rape to be evil today, what happens if something changes where the majority of people, for example, decide, well, rape's okay? Does that mean that we were wrong in believing what we did believe? No, because again, there's a standard that is always the way it is. And so again, this does not work. Let's go on with this. An absolute moral framework can only come from an absolute moral lawgiver who is changeless. It cannot change. Morality cannot change. When it comes to absolute moral laws, they cannot change. They are set in stone. And they must be in order for us to function as individuals and as society and as a culture as well. But an absolute moral lawgiver is who the atheist is trying to disprove when he says that evil exists. But he's not proving it. He is not proving that there is no God by saying that. In essence, when we really look at these things rationally, we see that it really points to God, because it points to a standard that only can be provided by a belief in a theistic God. Rather than disproving God, the recognition of evil demands there be a God. It's only because, remember C.S. Lewis, he said that the only way I knew that a line was crooked was by comparing it to a standard of a straight line. And so again, it points to the existence of God, not against the existence of God. Objections to the moral argument: morality is only cultural. Well, if that were true, then how about the widow burning in India? Was that morally okay? Because there was a part of their culture at one point in time where if a husband died and they would burn his body through cremation, they would also burn alive his widow so that she'd be able to be his wife in the afterlife or in the reincarnation that they were going to experience. And so again, this widow burning, was it right because culturally they accepted it? I don't think burning widows or anybody alive is ever right, and I don't think any human being that's normal thinks that's right either. It is morally wrong, and we believe that because of that conscience that we have, that moral law on the inside of us, written in our hearts. In some cultures, they love their neighbors, and in other cultures, they eat them. Which do you prefer? All right, I'm just going to go through these, and you think about these things. Does a land exist where murder is a virtue and thanksgiving a vice? Were the Nazis justified? I know I've mentioned this before, but let's use it again and think about it again. Justified in their actions, given the cultural, the culture power in Germany okayed their actions just because the government and the culture of Germany was being influenced to justify their actions? Did it make it right? Absolutely not. If the majority rule that rape is okay, does that make it right? You see, sometimes here in our democracy, we think democracy means the majority rules. And that's very dangerous, because if the majority decides that something that God says is wrong is right, then we are in trouble, and it's already been happening. And so again, we can't go by majority rule. We've got to go by what we know the standard is in our hearts. And of course, for Christians, the standard that is portrayed also in the Scriptures, all right? But we're talking about arguments for the existence of God, equipping us in order to share these things with those that don't necessarily believe the Bible, but yet they can see these things because it's written in their hearts, as we've already shown you. Is it okay for a culture to gratuitously torture innocent babies? Ever? Is it ever all right to do that? If none of the above is true, what or who is mankind morally obligated to? Real moral obligation exists, but to whom? Perhaps the relativist view has been influenced by their culture. You know, I was just hearing not long ago about a school teacher was talking about the kids at school and how many of the kids at school today say, well, you're not the boss of me. Obviously, that's a phrase that's popular today. You're not the boss of me. And you know, really, that's sort of a sentiment throughout our nation and maybe even parts of the world. I'm sure parts of the world as well. But nobody will admit, or nobody seems to want to submit to any kind of authority. Young people especially, they don't want to submit to authority. They don't believe that they need to submit to authority. I mean, they might have the phrase, who says so? Who says this is wrong? Who says that is wrong? Why? Because we have departed from this moral standard that God has put in our heart. And He's put it in our heart so that we can be healthy, so that we can be prosperous, so that we can be successful in every area of life if we'll go by that moral law. But when we begin to decline from that or depart from that, we begin to not have the great life that God has for human beings that will listen to that conscience on the inside of them. All right? And so these things are vital for us to know. There is a difference in what a culture is doing and what it ought to do. A difference in descriptive and prescriptive. In other words, you can describe what they're doing, but that doesn't mean that's what's been prescribed. What God has prescribed, what the moral law has prescribed for us, might not be a description of what any culture is carrying out, but that doesn't mean that they're right just because the culture says it's right. It's still against the moral law. Objections to the moral law. The third point in this is morality is relative. Is it ever okay to torture babies, abuse children, or rape someone? All right, I don't think so. Just because we have a twilight doesn't mean that we can't recognize day and night. What if we did the same thing with mathematics as we do with morals? What if we decided, you know what, I like 3 plus 3 equals 7. I don't like 3 plus 3 equals 6. I like 7 as an answer. Well, we're going to go with that? I don't think so, because 3 plus 3 is 6. That's an absolute law of mathematics. Let's not do it with morals, and as we already have, but let's get it right. Let's change our thinking to understand that there are absolute rights and wrongs in morality as well. How does one gauge if the world's getting better or worse without absolutes? Today we hear oftentimes, the world's getting worse, and not just from Christians. You can hear that from a lot of people in the world that don't even know Christ as their Lord. They'll say, oh, the world's just getting worse. How do you know the world's just getting worse? How do you measure better or worse if there's not a standard by which you measure that? Again, that is evidence that even in their hearts, the unbeliever's heart, there's a standard that tells them the world is getting worse. Without that, we wouldn't be able to say that. We wouldn't be able to measure that. I think that's clear. How does one settle moral disagreements without absolutes? Ends versus means are confused. For example, peace is desired, but how? In other words, does the end justify the means? In other words, if you want a certain result, does it matter how you get it? Or are there certain principles by which you need to adhere to in order to obtain those results? I believe that the means are important as well as the end result. A lot of people, they get results and good results, but if they didn't follow right principles, if they used a unscrupulous type of means, if they used dishonesty, if they lied, if they cheated in order to get to an end that appeared really well or really good, well, you know what? They went about it the wrong way and it makes it wrong. And so again, the end does not justify the means. And then going on, how many spouses desire their spouse to be relatively faithful? I mentioned this in lesson 2 to them rather than absolutely faithful to them. Relativists can't live what they preach. They just can't. And the question is not, must we believe in God in order to live moral lives, but do objective moral values exist without God? And the answer to that is no. There cannot be any objective moral values without an objective moral value giver. And that would be God. All right, notice what some intellectually honest individuals have said. And when I say intellectually honest, it doesn't mean they're intellectually honest with every area, because they're not, at least the ones I know of here. But they are in terms of this moral law. Notice what William Provine, an evolutionary biologist, said, and he's passed away now. I hope he repented and came to Christ beforehand. But notice what he said. When Darwin deduced the theory of natural selection to explain the adaptations in which he had previously seen the handiwork of God, he knew that he was committing cultural murder. He understood immediately that if natural selection explained adaptations and evolution by descent were true, then the argument from design was dead and all that went with it, namely the existence of a personal God, free will, life after death, immutable moral laws, and ultimate meaning in life. I remember hearing William Provine on a video one time on a presentation where he said there is no meaning to life. Why? Because he was an atheistic biologist, an evolutionary biologist, and he said there's no meaning to life. Of course not. If there is no God, there's no meaning to life. He states here that if there is no God, there's no immutable moral laws. He admitted that and was honest with that. Notice Richard Dawkins is honest in this particular area. He said humans have always wondered about the meaning of life. Life has no higher purpose than to perpetuate the survival of DNA. Life has no design, no purpose, no evil and no good, nothing but blind, pitiless indifference. What a terrible way to have to live, to think that way. But that's the road one goes on if they don't believe in a lawgiver, an objective moral lawgiver. That's the road they have to go with. There has to be that conclusion that if there is no objective moral lawgiver, there is no evil and there is no good. And so, Dawkins is honest in this statement, but obviously in other places he said things to really accuse the God of the Bible of wrongness. Obviously he doesn't believe in God, but the point is, again, how do you know what's evil without a standard? And Dawkins admits that basically in this statement as well. Also, Immanuel Kant, a philosopher from many years ago, said that morality necessitates God. Huxley, an agnostic, stated that man lives better when he posits there is a God. These are obvious conclusions that people would come to in regard to these things. All right, so do these conclusions tell us anything about God? Again, remember that if there is an objective moral law, the conclusion would be that there is an objective moral lawgiver, because all laws come from lawgivers. All right? So, do these conclusions tell us anything about God? Well, God may exist, but what kind of God are we dealing with? We've talked about what kind of God the existence of God arguments have given us. The cosmological argument, the best explanation of the beginning of the universe is God. We talked about the teleological argument and the best explanation for design in both the universe universe and life, and now the moral argument, the best explanation for having a standard of morality. He is the best explanation. So to summarize this then, what would we come up with? That the God reached from these conclusions, these three arguments for the existence of God. This is the character, the nature of that God. He's supernatural, and you might remember this when we talked about the cosmological and the teleological argument. This blends together those arguments and the characteristics of God with the characteristics of God that we would conclude from the moral argument. Notice, supernatural, omnipresent, immaterial spirit, very powerful, highly intelligent, immortal, eternal, immutable, infinite, singular, personal, purposeful, good, moral, caring, and possesses both unity and diversity. And you know what? If you look at these characteristics of God that we see from these three compelling arguments for God's existence, there is only one God that really we can point to when we look at that, and that is the God of the Bible, not the God of Islam, not the gods of the Hindus. Only one God really has all these characteristics, and that's the God of Christianity, and possibly Judaism. But we're going to point out in some other lessons that we're going to show you that Christianity is more provable than anything else as well when we come to Jesus, who He is, the resurrection, evidence for that, all of these things. When it's all said and done, my prayer is that we're going to conclude that the God that we see, the God that we see in creation, the God that we see in the world, the God that we experience in the objective moral standard, all the characteristics of this higher intellect points to the Christian God, and therefore only the Christian God, and ultimately the Father, Son, and Holy Ghost, the Lord Jesus Christ included, obviously. That is the only true God as we look at all of these things. Praise God. Well, thanks for being with us. Thanks for watching this lesson. I hope that you learned some great things from it, and I just pray that you be blessed and go through the notes and go through these lessons again and expound on them, get some other resources, and really grow in your ability to give a hope, to give an answer to the hope that is within you. God bless you.